Hello and welcome to this podcast. So, the contemporary image of the Viking has more in common with classical Greece than might be known to those reproducing and consuming this image. The stereotypical view of the Viking as a brute warrior was not actually popularized by artists with extensive knowledge of Old Norse literary and archaeological source material, but instead it is said to be based on general 19th century assumptions regarding barbarian warriors of any origin, combined with the use of imagery traditionally associated with classical mythological figures. While the resulting imaginary Viking had little in common with the historical Viking, his incorporation into an existing classical framework resulted in heightened recognizability and thus popularity. To explain the persisting glimpses of classical Greek imagery in 21st century popular culture, in this podcast, I would like to discuss the successful creative appropriation of Greek dramatical structure and imagery by German composer Richard Wagner in his operas. For a broader understanding of the impact that classical antiquity has had, it is necessary to look not only towards the time period itself, since what is known about it today is mostly a modern construct, but especially towards the ways it has been used and understood throughout the ages. As will become clear, appropriation of classical antiquity not only influenced our current view of Greece, but also that of other seemingly unrelated cultures. So, in the nation-building context of the 19th century, European nations began to look back at what they considered to be their nation's past, and construct an idealized view of this through artistic expressions. But before the emphasis was put on a traditional, local, and specific past, major Western powers such as Great Britain, France, and what was soon to become a unified Germany saw themselves as the inheritors of a common ancient civilization, Hellenic Greece. This Hellenocentric worldview was inspired by ideas introduced by Jan Joachim Winckelmann, who in his Geschichte der Kunst des Altertums imagined Hellenic art as the pinnacle of artistic achievement and believed its beauty and originality could never be fully recreated. While Winckelmann's focus was on material art, another Greek art form gained importance in the modern period, namely theater. And as with neoclassical material art and architecture, an understanding of the political and cultural context of people like Wagner is needed to understand the impact their works had and continue to have, as well as what classical antiquity meant to both them and their audiences. If we look at Richard Wagner, for him, the revival of Greek tragedy in the Renaissance was unsuccessful and remained a task for the future. Basing his own ideas on scholarly works available at the time, Wagner understood Greek theater as a religious festival reflecting the spirit of the nation, and aimed to give his own artistic creations a similar position. To realize this aim, he developed an opera called Der Ring des Nibelungen, to be performed in 3 days at the Bayreuth Festival, an event specifically designed by Wagner for the presentation of his works. What makes Wagner's work innovative compared to previous uses of classical imagery is that while his works are seen as inspired by the structure of Greek myth, he is the first to fully replace the Greek gods and heroes with Germanic ones. However, this replacement would not have been possible were it not for the high regards in which mythology, and particularly classical mythology, was held by Wagner's contemporaries. And while modern-day art historians like to theorize about the underlying motivations of the artists they study, this doesn't need to be done with Wagner. He was explicit regarding his love for ancient Greece, and was aware of the popularity that Greek mythology enjoyed within 19th century Germany. In his correspondence with Nietzsche, Wagner states that he does not believe there is any young man with a greater interest in classical Greece than he, and that it is the Greek ideals he bases his own philosophy and work on. He also stresses the importance of Homeric literature on shaping his ideas about drama and theater. These statements are further elaborated by Wolfgang Schadewald, an important yet controversial 20th century German classical philologist. In his lecture series called Richard Wagner and the Greeks, he provides a selection of events from Wagner's life that explain his interest in classical Greece. He also sees that Wagner's creative appropriation of the Greeks was intended to have lasting effects for the future. In this biography, Wagner is described as trying to combine the Greek ideal with the German spirit, and it is in Der Ring des Nibelungen that this goal is best seen, through the combination of the dramatical construction of Greek myth with the newly discovered so-called Germanic literary source materials. While using characters and stories from Old Norse saga literature, particularly the Volsunga saga. The structure of this play is directly based on the trilogy of Prometheia by Aeschylus, albeit already in a German reworking by Droysen. What is also important to note here is that the language of Wagner's operas was German, reflecting Wagner's opinions on the relationship between language, culture, and nation. The Greeks had their Greek art, and now it was time for the Germans to have German art. Schadewald concludes that it is impossible to actually revive Greek tragedy because its historical uniqueness, reflecting Winckelmann's ideas, but that Wagner's awareness of classical constructions like individualism and fate facilitated his creation of an opera with lasting cultural influences far beyond the 19th century. But a point of criticism regarding Schadewald's account of Wagner is that he was specifically looking for a direct Hellenic inspiration within Wagner's work, leading to a potential overemphasis of Wagner's love for antiquity. Instead, it could be suggested that while Hellenic Greece was an important factor in shaping the ideas of Wagner and his contemporaries, what is omitted by Schadewald is the ideas of the purity of the German race that Wagner proposed. It is not love for Hellenic art that drove Wagner to use it as an inspiration, but its usefulness for shaping an increasingly more racial understanding of German national identity. Paradoxically, Wagner attempted to at once preserve aspects of classical antiquity, as well as replacing them progressively with Germanic elements. And because he managed to present his ideological messages using a framework that would be understood by his contemporaries, his work continued to be used in the shaping of not only German, but also Scandinavian national identities. Even with its messages of anti-Semitism and racial superiority, the image of the Viking warrior as inspired by the classical heroes became so anchored in the popular mind that it has kept its recognizability up to this day. The image of the Viking, shaped in part by Wagner's depiction, continues to reflect its origins in classical antiquity both visually and symbolically. The symbolic aspects have been discussed, namely the idea of the masculine Viking barbarian warrior. Another thing that has kept its relevance into the 21st century is Wagner's classically inspired costume designs, most notably the infamous horned and winged helmets. While Wagner did not invent this image himself, and it can be explained by the archaeological and artistic material available at the time, his opera can be seen as crucial for the dissemination of these classical elements for a broader public. Even though a fair share of the 21st century consumers of popular culture are aware of the historical inaccuracy of the horned helmet, it is still used for Viking-themed cultural and consumer products. Especially for branding purposes, a warrior with horned helmets is used to communicate values that can be associated with Vikings, such as bravery, adventurousness, pride, and masculinity. These values became attached to the imaginary Vikings in the 19th century, inspired by Romanticist ideals, which were in turn inspired by classical ideals. So, in conclusion, almost paradoxically, the popularity of the Vikings in their stereotypical form has been made possible by the interest in classical antiquity that was present at the time the Vikings started being discovered as a tool for legitimizing German and Scandinavian national identities. And as popular interest in the Vikings continues into the 21st century, classical elements are still used in new media like Marvel's comics and films representing the Norse gods. The characters' pretty classical appearances bear more resemblances to popular media depictions of Greek myths than to Viking-related media using more extensive archaeological research for their costume designs. The choice to present a god like Thor as a superhero shows yet again the same underlying values that inspired Wagner, albeit this time repackaged in the context of Cold War America. And again, the makers were not directly inspired by Old Norse sources, but general mythological works, focusing on Greek mythology, already simplified and adjusted for an American audience. So, not only does this illustrate how values, imagery, and dramatic structures from classical Greece continue to show up in perhaps unexpected places today, it also shows how the use of such ingrained repertoires keeps less accurate but more culturally recognizable works more popular. And this in turn provokes questions about the importance of accuracy and authenticity in popular culture. Finally, Wagner's work illustrates how a sanitized version of classical Greece as a perfect homogeneous culture was used to construct a justification for German racial supremacy. This deeply problematic origin of what later developed into the popular image of the Viking needs to be kept in mind because it illustrates the dangers of the idealization of classical antiquity. Thank you for listening.